Hey gang, it is Monday, December 4th, 2017, and this is a continuation of Brooklyn Pony Part 15, so this would be Part 15B. For those of you that were watching the previous video, you know that I'm installing this Mustang torque arm rear suspension from TCI, and I had some complications with that, but I managed to get the frame connectors in place and the floor stiffener, and I had to do a bunch of modifications to make that work, but it's going to work just fine. So this part I'm going to continue on. I've got a bunch of other pieces yet to install. I've got more brackets and hardware. This is actually part of the installation of the front section. I'm not going to get into that just at the moment, but it's just some brackets for that. There are various bags of bolts and hardware and different things, and so I'm going to go over some of this. But this kit is it's a combination of things. You got frame connectors, this floor stiffener, this torque shaft or torque arm, the rear mounts for the link arms, and of course you got coilover shocks and everything. So I've already gone through the front section of this and done all this work. And there's what I was talking about, these brackets that are going to go in. Of course, this picture here shows it as a coupe, and I'm doing a convertible, if you don't already know. So I'm skipping through these sections here because it's really part of that forward area that I've already done. And I want to get into this part. Now, these are some of the Crossmember channel bracket, they call it. There's two pieces. There's one on the driver's side and the passenger side, and this one, being on the passenger side, has this big support arm, and that is that piece right there. Now, according to the directions, it needs to go up against this bracket that would be for your bumper, that would for the axle to bump up against. So I'm going to show you something with that in just a minute. I showed you the drilling that's going to happen. There's a drill guide that comes in the kit, and that's this piece right here. And it just shows the installation of all that. Also, it shows this coilover sway bar mount, and there's complications with that as well that I'm running into. And of course, this next section is welding on all the brackets to the differential housing, and they're already attached. And there you can see how some of the stuff is going to interact. So let me just show you what the dilemma is at this point. And I've already said in the previous video, I don't have a problem with the TCI product. I think, or I know, they designed this product to fit an original car, and that's why I've had complications with the measurements and making things fit. You have to see the previous videos to know what all I had to do to get this to fit, but I'm done with that and I'm happy with it. Here's part of the problem with this section. This is the bracket for the driver's side, and as it says in the instructions, it is supposed to be all the way up here. There's no way this is going to make it all the way up here. The big problem is, and I know it's hard to tell, but the width of the frame rail in this location, it has a taper. This actually gets narrower as it goes back. Maybe you can see it there. And that's good, that's fine, that's how they were designed. However, the Dynacorn frame rail is fatter than the original frame rail. And I can verify this because I can take this bracket, not at this moment, but I can take this bracket, pry it back off of here, and it'll fit right on the frame rail for the 68 that's in the back and where it's supposed to fit. And let me just show you this. Maybe you can see it, maybe you can't, but this has that same taper. See how it gets fatter at the front? Okay. If I put this up against this frame rail, it's not going to fit at all. I measured this out. I believe it's 130 thousandths difference. That's a lot. And the reality is I could, if I really wanted to, take a mallet or a hammer, drive this thing all the way forward, and just smash it on there, because that's what it would take. There's no way, aside from cutting out this frame rail and putting in a narrower one, it would be more original, or cutting this frame rail and actually pinching it together and re-welding it, making it closer to where this would actually fit on. And I'm not going to do that. Or collapsing this, which is not a good idea. So my thoughts are, I'm going to modify the bracket. When this is installed, it shows only 2 bolts going up through the floor pan and into, or being exposed on the top side. And there's these little brackets somewhere in here. Yeah. These little brackets are supposed to sit on the floor pan and have the bolts go down through and hold those on. Secondly, it has bolts that go through sideways. 1, 2, 3. That's nice. It's good and solid. However, there's no way that I'm going to, first of all, be able to get this in place without destroying something. And then these bolts aren't going to do much anyway, because this thing would be wedged on there, and it's just not going to work. So my plan is I'm going to split this thing in half. I'm going to cut it somewhere. I don't know if it'll be dead on this center, or if I'll come off to an edge. I haven't decided yet. But I'm not going to bolt this thing in with these bolts going up through the floor pan. I'm going to weld this on, just like I did with these brackets here that are supposed to be bolted on, or they're designed to be bolted on. I welded those on. So I'm going to split this somewhere, get it in the proper location where it belongs, and then weld the edges, and of course weld the seam wherever it is that I split it, and make this thing solid. The point of that is, even if it's designed to be removed or replaced or whatever at some point, or designed to be a slip-on unit, you couldn't get that off if it was beat on there. It would just destroy the frame rail, and it would mangle everything, and it would be almost impossible to remove it in the first place. So rather than have all the bolts sticking through the floor and not be satisfied with how it's going to fit, I'm going to make it fit the car, and it'll be more solid and more rigid than it was in the design. Same thing with this piece. I'm going to split it as well, and being that it has this bracket welded on, I'm probably going to have to come over this corner and split that corner off, get it up in place, do all my alignments so my holes transfer straight across, and then get that in place. Now, along with all that, and I know I like to talk about things because I want to make sure people understand what's going on. This thing, which is your sway bar and your coilover shock mount. If you can look at it, that's got a taper, and that's got a taper, right? Okay. The floor, the rails, they taper away. If you're looking square on, they taper out, let's say from center. This is designed to bolt into those holes, and the bolt holes that will be on the other side. It's designed to slip up between those new brackets and be supported. Unfortunately, even if I go, let's say, to the exact location, it's not going to work. Let me set the other side. I'll set that edge back against and come up over here. It's just a little bit too long. That's without the brackets in place. So the reality is, I'm going to have to modify this as well. Now that won't be so bad, because what I can do is find center, split it, eliminate whatever material I need to make this thing fit, put a sleeve inside of it, probably do some plug welds out here somewhere to stabilize it, and then weld the seam and make this thing solid again. That won't hurt anything as far as structure, but it's just what I'm going to have to do. So I know that's a lot of talking and a lot of information, but if I don't explain it, I feel like I'm doing you a disservice. I want you to know what's going on and why I'm doing what I'm doing. So I'll get started on this and we'll see how it goes. Alright, this is the passenger or driver's side, and you can see that I've split it, and I used my plasma cutter, set a guide on it, just had a piece of angle iron clamped to it, used it as a guide, and now you can see just how much space is needed to make this fit around that frame rail. Now the plasma cutter is going to cut off, maybe a 1/16 or so, maybe just a little bit more than a 1/16, but that's a lot of material. And for the most part, that's going to work out just fine. It looks like it's going to line up, and I'll double check, make sure it's square before I do any welding. And of course, I'll put some primer behind it, make sure it's protected. And once that's all in place, I will also weld these holes so they attach to the floor, so it's good and solid up there as well. But for now, the plan is just to weld that perimeter all the way around, and again, weld that split. And there it is, welded in place. I'm calling that a success. Welded all on the edges, of course the split seam, all the way around the perimeter. I still have to weld the holes shut into the floor. It's hard to see. And I have to drill the holes that are required, but that shouldn't be a big deal. And now I'll move on and get the passenger side cut and fitted in place and get it welded. Alright, so as you can see, I split this on this corner. This bracket was going to be in the way otherwise, and it just made it easier to split that corner off. And now it fits nice, but you can see how big that gap is. There's no way that thing was going to fit on there without some serious abuse. But now it fits nice. So I'll do the same thing that I did on the other side and weld that in, and that's going to take care of the rear brackets, or the rear frame rail brackets. Well, I think that's it for tonight. As you can see, I've got it again welded around the perimeter. Very solid, not going anywhere. Very happy with that. So the next step will be drilling those holes and getting those, in place. So that shouldn't be too bad. And then I'll move on to shortening that support brace for the coilover shocks and the sway bar. Now, as I said in the previous segment, the next step is to drill the holes through these support brackets. And you can see I've already done that on this side, and things are going pretty smooth. I want to show you how this works out on the other side. Now, what they tell you to do is take a 3/8 drill bit and drill through these outer 3 holes, and then the forward hole on the inside you can drill as well, but the other 2 are hidden behind the sheet metal, so you can't drill straight through those from the inside. However, you can do it with this drill bushing, and they provide that, which is nice. So just to show you what I did, I took a center punch and tapped a hole, or tapped into the center of this one, or all of them actually that I could reach. Hit them with a center punch and then drilled that with a 3/16 drill bit. You could do it with a 3/8 bit and just, hog it in there, but I like to do it in steps. It's just easier on the drill and the equipment. So I drilled a 3/16 hole, and then I stepped it up with my step-up bit, and then I followed it up with the 3/8 drill bit. And like I said, this guide, that thing is good. What you do, you set your drill bit in there, position the flange so that it's flat against the surface, and then clamp it on, and then you make sure your drill is smoothly going in and out of that bushing, and then you attack the other side. I've already done this hole all the way through, and as you can see, that lines up nice. And that was the one that I drilled from the inside, but this secondary hole that I've already drilled, you can see the drill bit, it came through nice and even as well. So I'm happy with that. I'm going to finish drilling these, and that'll be it as far as this part of the process. So with all the holes drilled, the next step is installing this cross member, which will support the coilover shocks and the sway bar. Now, as I pointed out earlier, I was concerned with how it was going to fit. It seemed to be too narrow, and it is a little bit too narrow. After mocking it up in place and being able to get a bolt started on the driver's side, the passenger side, it's just too tight. Now, I could hammer this thing up in there and make it fit, but there's a little bit of a gap. Maybe you can see it there. Camera, the light's blocking me. But there's a little bit of a gap on the back side. And, you know, like I said, I could beat this thing into place, but I don't want to do that because the plan still is to get this pipe or this bar powder coated as well. So I have to have a little bit of allowance for the fitment to get in there, even with, you know, some powder coating on it. So based on the fact that this side back here has a gap, I plan to cut the front edge, cut a line, probably about 2/3 of the way through, and that'll allow that plate to pivot just a little bit, and then I'll re-weld that, and that'll take care of the fitment on this side. As you can see, you can just see there's a gap on this side, and I may end up doing something similar on this side, but I won't have to cut the pipe in half like I had suggested earlier, which is a good thing. And I think that'll correct those minor issues, and I'll be further ahead in the long run. So I'll get started on that and hopefully get that in place soon. Okay, so I pulled that bar back out, and as you can see, I wanted to show you there's a relief cut, and there's a relief cut, and that allows that plate to move just a little bit without changing its location on the pipe. As you can see, there's still some weld evident there, and a lot more on that side. Well, now I have the bar set in place, and I'm happy with it. The gap is very small at this point, and that's good, because once it has paint and powder coating on everything, you need a little bit of room for stuff to fit, and that's just right. And that really didn't change much. You can see I closed up the gap just a little bit on each end. Hopefully you can see that. So now what I'll do is weld those, or weld them. I'll have them on the car the way they are, and I'll put some tacks on there so that I know nothing moves, and then I'll fully weld that back off the car. And now it's fully welded, and it fits just as well as it did a minute ago. A little bit of room, that's good. And I think the next part will be actually mocking up all of the pieces together and getting the housing setting in place. Once that is done, I'm going to take everything back out, obviously, and get it to the powder coaters so that all the stuff can be treated. And then I have more plans for the bottom of the car. I was provided with lizard skin, and so I've got to do some prep work to get that on, and a bunch of little things, but primarily I need to get this all mocked up so that I can then get it to the powder coaters. Well, it's finally warmed up enough that I can get out here in the garage. We've had some bad weather over the past week here in Georgia, so when it's cold I don't work well, as I've said before. But I wanted to show you some progress, and I'm trying to show some progress, but I'm struggling with some things. If you follow the instructions, it shows you assembling the various brackets, putting in bolts, putting in spacers, and it tells you about different lengths and stuff like that to use. And then it shows putting in the trailing arm. And if you're looking at it straight up from the bottom, you can see this is that one bracket. This is the actual location where the original leaf spring would have gone. And here's another angle. So if you're looking at it from the back, like that, and we can mimic that here on the driver's side. Well, as you know, there's been fitment issues with this thing, and I want to show you a couple things that will continue to be a problem. This side, the bracket lines up pretty well. I can get these upper bolt to move through nicely, that's fine. There's a little bit of tension on this, but this bracket has clearance against the floor support, so that's a good thing. On the passenger side, or driver's side, it hits. So it's hitting the floor. I'll have to address that a little bit. I don't know if it's just some fat weld here, or this was welded together by Dynacorn. I think that's all it is. But either way, that has to be addressed because I can't get the bolts in. Okay, now let's move on to the other parts. This calls for a spacer here if you're running the street configuration. Basically, you can run the trailing arm up high or down low, and it breaks it down. It says trailing arm will be installed either in the top hole for the stock spring location, street application, or the bottom hole, strip application. Well, that's fine. It doesn't really matter to me. I'm going to set it up as if it's a stock spring location for street use. It makes sense. Well, as I pointed out, it calls out for these spacers, and that's what I've done. I've installed the wider spacer at the bottom here, and the trailing arm is supposed to go here, and then another spacer over here to make up that gap that would normally be made up by the leaf spring. Well, these are the spacers, and they're about 1 inch wide. My thumb's 1 inch wide, I know, and that's 1 inch. Well, here is the trailing arm, and it talks about adjusting the length of the trailing arm prior to installation, but I'm not going to do that just yet. I want to show you this. Put the trailing arm up, and there's just not quite enough room. Now, this bracket is not tight. There's a gap here where that bolt is, and this bolt, there's no nut or anything on it. It's just sitting there. So this is just where that sits. So now I've got a little bit of a fitment issue going on with that. Somehow I'm going to have to make this move out a little bit, and I don't know what is causing that. But the other thing I want to show you is this 1 inch spacer is supposed to go on the outside. Well, it'll fit. Pretty good gap there. So I'm going to have to play with that and see if I can't figure out a way to get this bracket to move out a little bit. I may have to put a washer or something in between to move this out. I'm not going to go get new pieces made, but for whatever reason, there are some things that I have to adjust. So I'll get working on that and try to get this other bracket to fit better and see if I can't move forward. Alright, so I've made a little bit of progress. With this bracket, I ground down those welds off the edge of the pan here, and now the bracket fits like it should. And I thought that was all it was going to need. So I think once the trailing arm and everything's in place, it's going to be fine. However, I know it's kind of hard to see this. This hole does not line up with that bolt, and my lift is in the way. But and that's going. It has that upper bolt going through the bracket, and so I'm going to have to address that. I'm not sure why it's doing this. There's no way to move it really any further back because of that upper hole. The forward hole is slotted, so it does allow for movement forward and aft, but I think what I'll have to do is open up this hole, that edge, and then weld the front edge shut, because this hole needs to fit this bolt. So I'll have to get that addressed, and then move on to other things. Alright, so now I think I really am making some progress. I don't have the trailing arms in place yet, but I figured out to make this one fit on the passenger side, and I think there will be enough room there. I added a washer here and up front, and that way it keeps the plane the same on that bracket. I don't want to have any binding, so that should maintain that. And this bolt is tight right now, but I think if it was loose, I could slip that up inside there and it would be fine. And then I'll have to shim this bushing, maybe add another washer in there. It would help if these washers were just a little bit thicker, and I may do some research and see if I can't find something. On the driver's side, you can see there that will slip in, and this shows the gap that's left over. So again, I will shim this and the front area there, and beyond that I did re-drill this hole. So now you can see, or actually I ground the edge with a rotary file. So now I have to weld that front part solid and make sure the hole is correct. So I feel better about it now. I am making some progress, and hopefully I can show you some more soon. Okay, things are starting to come together now. I've got the trailing arm on the passenger side in place, and it's nice and firm as it should be. There's no wiggle side to side, which is good. And what I ended up doing, I did use one washer here, and then to make it easier, I spent more time on it than I probably should have, but I welded onto the end of this bushing and ground it until it matched overall the width of the trailing arm. And then once I put in the 1-inch bushing up here and tighten everything up, everything's fitting just fine. So that's probably what I'll have to do on the other side as well, is just build up the end of this bushing and make it work. So at this point, things are bolted in and snug on the passenger side, and I'll still work on the driver's side. I did weld up the hole that needed to be addressed, so that's taken care of, and the bolt fits nice through there. So I'll work on the driver's side tomorrow, and hopefully have this ready to go, and try to get the differential mounted in here soon. Well, I have both sides in place, and everything seems to be fitting just fine. So I'm going to move on to the next part, which is installing this sway bar. And of course, everything is just being mocked up at this point so that I can verify fitment. But as the instructions show here, they're showing that bracket being mounted to the bar that I just previously installed, and then they have these bushings and then these collars, and of course putting it in place. So really, here's the bushing and the collar on the main bracket, and it's really not that hard. Now, showing what they're looking at this here, it appears that they have the collar up against the rubber side of the bushing, and in this case I don't have it set up that way. I'm just showing you that's not the correct way. So from what I'm gathering, and let me see if I can get this in place. you would actually slip that on, and then this collar is split, this bushing, so you can just slip it around the main shaft, slide it over, get it in place. And of course it's showing it with lubricant, and I'm not putting that on right now because I'm not ready for that. And then the collar, the retainer, there's a little cap screw that threads into that as well, and it has an Allen head in it, and you just slip that over. And that's what they're, from what I'm seeing in the instructions. Now once this is bolted in place, this isn't going to move. You know, that bushing, that's why they're trapping it against that collar so that it doesn't move, because these brackets aren't going to move once they're assembled. It is saying to install it with these 1-inch bolts. I think it's 1 inch by 3/8. And so let me get that in place, and we'll drive on from there. Let me give you a little bit of advice. I just learned this. You know, it shows them installing this with you know, bolting it onto that tube assembly that's already in place. It doesn't say anything that I could see about having problems getting the bolt through that bracket. Whoops, let me try that again. Getting the bolt through that bracket. So what I would suggest is, before installing that bracket, you slip the bolts through the holes and then slip it on, and then you won't have to fight with the shaft being in the way. Alright, so as you can see, I have the differential set up on some jack stands. I have the torque arm, and I have various other pieces and parts set out, and hopefully I can get all this assembled today and be done with the mock-up. I want to go over a couple things. As I was in the previous segment, I talked about this sway bar and then the installation of it up into the bracket, and that went fine. It bolted up just like it should. It is loose. I didn't need to tighten it up at this point, so I'm not going to. I wanted to point out there are these little end links that come in packages for the connection, and basically these just get threaded together, and there's a jam nut that goes in between, and so eventually this will be on the end of this, and that'll interact with this bracket on the housing. So that's how that goes, and they just came in individual packets, whatever they want to call it, tire or rod end. So just know that those thread together, and like I said, the jam nut. The other thing I wanted to point out as I go through these instructions is the next segment covers installing all the hardware and brackets to the differential. And since this one is already built, you don't have to worry about that, so that's a good thing. In this segment it talks about bolting the torque arm to the bottom of the differential, and then mounting these pinion support tubes. And it points out here that they have left and right hand rod ends to facilitate angle adjustment. And all it's saying is one end turns clockwise and the other end turns counterclockwise. So they want us to put the clockwise normal right hand rotation at the top, and as you can see it's inside the bracket, and the left hand counterclockwise in the bottom. And so you can turn that rod, and that'll make it, you know, extend or contract based on your rotation. So it's just showing that assembly process. Here it is. They're hanging the shocks off the bracket, and they're showing these various spacers and big bolts, and I'm just going to show you some things on that as well. And here they are putting the torque arm up through the transmission hoop, and then of course assembling everything with the bolts and hardware. That's all fine. That should work out just like it should. It does mention the torque arm slider, which is what is in this tube, and I don't know that I'm going to play around with that just yet, because it's going to be sent to powder coating, and I don't know if I want to try to get that in place or not. one thing I was a little confused by, as I was looking at the shocks, both boxes say rear adjustable plane. Rear adjustable plane. And at first, I opened this box because it says rear on it. And I started mocking things up, and I was concerned because this big bolt is supposed to go through one of these ends, because that big bolt goes through this bracket on the housing. And I was a little upset because I thought, well, maybe there's something wrong here, or this is a different setup. But thankfully, I'll open the other box, and that'll go through just fine. So that takes care of that question. This kit, this little package here, appears to have everything in it that I need to install those shocks. There are a few other bags of items here that I still don't know where everything goes, because some of it's a little confusing. Panhard Bar Bolt Kit, that's simple enough, but there's a lot of hardware in there for just being the Panhard bar, which is that bar over there. And that will attach, the ends will attach, one will attach here, and the other one will attach here on the differential. So I'm not sure why all this extra stuff is in there. This bolt here had another bolt with it, and it's torque arm installer bolt. Well, when I took that out, the torque arm will attach down here, and this bolt is too short for that. I mean, there's just enough. If you put washers on, that's going to really, no threads. But there was another bolt that is the right length, and it was just, it showed up in this somewhere loose in the kit, so that'll work for the torque arm. So let me get started on this. I want to get those shocks in place and then start assembling all these rods and various pieces to the differential. Well, that went together fairly easy. I didn't have any issues really, other than having to play with this adjustment just a little bit in order to get this bolt to go all the way through. I have noticed that I'm missing the two nuts that would go on the end of these, so I'm going to have to go buy some of those. The shock absorbers, or coilovers, they fit just fine. The bolt will have to go from the front to the back. There's no way you'll get it in because of the floor opening for the trunk. And I wanted to point this out. This is where the Panhard bar will bolt to, and this is one of the bolts from the kit. Always check your holes, because I don't want to force that in there, and for some reason they go through nicely on the backside. So I'll just skim those with a drill bit to open them up a little bit. But the point is, always check these things before you get too far along to where you're stuck. Same way here, went just fine in that bracket. So I'm going to take care of those holes, and then I think the plan is to lower the car down and work the differential up underneath it. Alright, so I have the housing in place. I have the shocks, the bolts going through the shock mounts. I don't have the sway bar hooked up. I don't know where the bolts are for that, but I'll find them, or I'll buy some, one of the two. And I have the bolts going through the lower hole on the bracket for the differential. Now it says here, install the trailing arm bars in the top holes in the axle brackets for street applications, lower hole for strip applications. And we talked about this earlier with the location on the front as well. So in this case I have them in the bottom, but for street it needs to be in the top hole. But I wanted to show you something. These shocks are designed to be adjusted up and down. You have 3 different mount points, and with the big nylock nut that's provided, there's really no room to get this one on if you're using that middle hole without moving this up. Just an observation. You know, if I was in a lower hole, it would be no problem. But I don't see how you're supposed to be able to use the other two holes if you can't get that nut on, especially this upper one. There's no way you can get that nut on with the current setup. So I'll move this up anyway, and then get this nut in place, and we'll have another look at it. And there it is with everything mounted and in place. Everything seems to fit fairly well. I did have to adjust a few things, obviously, but I'm pretty happy with the fitment. As you can see, I have the trailing arm up in the second hole, or the upper hole, and that gave me clearance to get the shocks mounted as they should be. Currently I just have bolts going through the Panhard bar, and I do not have any bolts in the sway bar, but that's not an issue. Everything else is in place. I'm missing some nuts for the ends of these bolts. I don't know where they're at, but I'll get some or take care of those. On the other end of the Panhard bar, I did use a longer bolt just to get it in place, but I found the correct one, so that'll go in. And same thing over here, bolt in the upper hole, and then the shock mount. Overall, I'm happy with it. It took more work than I expected it to, but sometimes that's the way it is. Hopefully, you know, the information I've shared with you will help you out if you're trying to decide if you want to do a TCI. With a Dynacorn, I think you're going to run into problems like I did. But if it was an original car, I think you'd be fine. So just keep that in mind. But that'll be the end of this video, which I guess will be labeled 15B. And that's all I really have to say. You know, I try to be as honest as I can and show you problems and how I address them and take care of things, and I think I did a pretty good job with that. So hope it was informative, and hope you learned something. And once again, thanks for watching.